What's up, YouTube? KS Gun Guy here. Thanks for joining me today, as always. If you like what you see here, do be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and there's plenty more content on the way. So I've got for you guys today another episode of the If I Could Only Have One series. And in this series, I take two firearms, whether very similar or in some cases very different, and I look at a variety of different things about the firearms. I look at the specs. We talk a little bit about the features. I may talk about the value a little bit. We'll wheel in shooting, of course, along the way, and I'll talk a little bit about the triggers, and of course, I'll give a summary at the end and announce a winner. Now, here's the thing. Both of these guns are fantastic. I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other. I just think it's fun to take a step back and look at your collection and challenge yourself. If I could only have one of those, which one would it be? Which brings us here. So if you have either one of these firearms or you're looking at either one, I think you're doing great either way. So let's go ahead and take a look at these here for just a moment. Of course, they are both empty. They do have an empty magazine as usual. I just prefer that. Same thing with the 17, of course. So from a spec standpoint, I oftentimes don't cover all of these, but because these are relatively close, I thought it'd be a good idea to do it. So from a length standpoint, the M&P is 7.4 inches versus 7.95 inches on the 17. The height is 5.5 inches on the M&P versus 6.14 inches on the G17. So a little bit of difference, certainly from height standpoint. Barrel length is 4 1/4 on the M&P and 4.49 inches on the Glock 17. I'll give you a good look at the width here. So the width on the M&P is 1.3 inches versus 1.34 inches on the 17. We'll talk about why that width changed a little bit on the 17 here very shortly. From a weight standpoint, we're at 24.7 ounces rather on the M&P versus 25.26 ounces on the G17. From a magazine capacity standpoint, the M&P does have a 17-round magazine. It comes with two, and these are steel construction. They're readily available to purchase, and they probably fall somewhere in the $30 or so range, depending on where you look. Now, the Glock 17, this is the Gen 5 version. It does come with three 17-round magazines. These are polymer magazines, although they do have a steel insert in them. So certainly very rugged either way. So let's talk about features just a little bit on both of these firearms. Again, this is not really a deep dive into them, but just to cover some of the basic features. One of the most outstanding features, and I say outstanding just because it was the most remarked on feature of the M&P 2.0 released earlier this year, was the grip texture. And most people have called this a fairly aggressive, and I've called it a very aggressive grip texture. Now I've gotten a little bit more used to it, and it is certainly doable. I will tell you, if you're shooting this gun is going absolutely nowhere. So if you are into a more aggressive grip, almost a custom stipple job out of the box, the M&P 2.0 definitely does the job. They do give you a little indention right here if you need to pull out magazines to clear a malfunction, which is really nice. And it does come with a total of 4 back straps, from small all the way to large and everything in between, even a couple that have a little bit more meat back here in the back if you're into that. So you definitely have some options to customize it just a little bit. All you have to do is twist this little tool and pull it out. You can change out your back straps, which is nice. So from the magazine button standpoint, it is reversible from what I understand. I don't really have a need to do that so much, but they did make it metal, which is kind of nice. And I've always said Smith & Wesson magazine releases are in the right place. They're the right size and the right height for this particular gun, so it works really well. Now you can get the M&P 2.0 with a safety. I opted without. I just prefer polymer firearms without the safety, but that is an option. From a slide release standpoint, it is ambidextrous out of the box. However, it's pretty stout. Now one of the reasons is they put this little dingus right here, and this actually prevents the slide from going home when you ram a magazine into the gun, which you used to be able to do pretty easily with the M&P 1.0. You do get your accessory rail for lights, lasers, grenade launchers, so standard feature there. Now they did increase the steel inserts to the front of the frame to make it a little bit more stiff, a little bit more rigid to help with the. I I guess, recoil to a certain extent, but just to keep that frame a little bit more stable. I haven't really noticed that it helped with recoil quite so much, but it's there nonetheless. From a takedown standpoint, and I'm not going to take the gun down in this particular video, but you would lock the gun back and then turn your takedown lever, and you can either pull the trigger after that and the slide will come off, or there's actually a little lever in here that you can pull down, and you can take the slide off without pulling the trigger. It's your choice. From a slide standpoint, one thing I really like about the M&P line are these fish scale serrations. I think they're really nice looking, and they are also extremely usable, which is great. So I think it's aesthetically pleasing and very usable or user-friendly. Now, they also did add front serrations here, just barely right here, and I think this is basically for aesthetics, although I suppose you could probably use them for press checks if you absolutely had to. However, the top of the slide, there is actually a little peephole so you can see if there's a round in the chamber. So not really sure you have to do press checks, but you could if you wanted to. They did scallop the slide just a little bit more for the 2.0 to reduce weight a little bit. I think that helps compensate for the extra steel in front of the frame. So good on them for that. From a sight standpoint, you do get steel sights out of the box, which is kind of nice. And these are good sights. They're a 3-dot sight setup, and I think they've actually improved them from the 1.0 a little bit. I know that sounds kind of crazy. One thing I remember with the 1.0s, the paint would come out very easily on these sights, and I have not noticed that to be the case with this. Perhaps I got some dud ones back in the day, but either way, I think they work. They do have a ledge for your one-handed manipulations, which is great. So that's the features on the M&P 2.0. From a Glock standpoint, again, the Glock 17 Gen 5, quite a few different things going on here. Not a deep dive into the Gen 5 necessarily. If you want to see a deep dive, check out some of my other videos on the Gen 5, whether the 19 or the 17. But some outstanding features nonetheless. One of the big ones being they got rid of the finger grooves. And I think a lot of people have said yay, a lot of people have said nay, and some people have said who cares one way or the other. I generally agree with that with the 19. However, with the 17, for whatever reason, it just feels a little bit better in my hand without the finger grooves. Now, that's just my hand. Others may differ on that, but I think it's just fine that they got rid of them. It wasn't necessarily a perk to have them. They did flare out the magwell just a little bit. I won't be able to show you this very well in this particular video. Again, check out some of my other ones. But they did make it just a little bit easier for magazine insertion, which is great. However, and you're probably going to be able to see, I'll tilt this up, there's a little bit of a cutout or a scallop here in the front of the frame. And Glock's intention for that is to be able to pull out magazines just a little bit easier. I've seen a lot of videos saying, well, it's kind of stupid to have it in front like this and not have it on the sides, which is a little bit more intuitive. I agree, except I like the flared magwell, and so I guess it's a sacrifice one way or the other. I really don't mind that they did the cutout here. I've gotten used to it, and on the 17, I don't really notice it. The 19, I've gotten used to a little bit more, so it's not really a big deal one way or the other. They did make a couple of changes to the magazine. Won't spend much time on this. They recontoured the base plate just a little bit to go along with that scalloped front on the frame. And congratulations, they gave us an orange follower in here. Nobody really cares about that, but I suppose from a visibility standpoint, if you want to know that your firearm is empty, it might be just a little bit easier from a visual standpoint. They did undercut the trigger a little bit more, although I will say it is hardly noticeable. But I'm glad they did just a little bit. I think perhaps, although we don't notice it very much, I think it probably is just a little bit better. It does have an accessory rail for your lights, lasers, grenade launchers, as you would expect, of course. One other notable change on this, they did make it more ambidextrous. In other words, the magazine button can be switched, of course, but they also gave us the slide lock, slide release on the right-hand side. So this is now really a more left-handed friendly gun, if that pertains to you. I won't go into the internals quite so much. Just know that a lot of the internals on the firearm have changed significantly. Again, I went into a more deep dive on that on my initial video with both of these firearms, so check that out, of course. From a slide standpoint, they did put on a new finish. They're saying it's a more durable finish. It's an NDLC finish right there. I don't know that it's going to be any more durable. Time will tell on that. I will say, though, it is certainly a little bit more slick. It reminds me more of a perhaps an older Gen 3 Glock, so definitely more slick. It'll be interesting to see some of these channels like Honest Outlaw and Military Arms Channel when they do their elemental tests, how well the Gen 5s will fare on that. So We'll have to wait and see, or perhaps they've done them by the time this video comes out. Who knows? They did not carry forward the front serrations like the FS model earlier this summer. Unfortunately, I would have liked to have seen that, but they do have the standard serrations on the back. And then the gun out of the box typically comes with your plastic sights, although there are some different options out there. You could do steel sights, and you could even do some night sights from Ameriglow. I believe even some Glock night sights if you want to. So they do give you a couple of sight options. I actually got the regular one, switched out the plastic sights for the True Glow TFX sights. I really like these sights quite a bit, especially for a larger firearm like the 17. So they do just fine for me. Not really a video on those so much. But that's kind of what you can expect for your Gen 5 Glock, at least the 17. So that's enough about the features and the specs about both of these firearms. So let's go ahead and take a look at some shooting at the range. And when we come back, we will take a look at the triggers. And of course, again, I'll be announcing a winner after that. So stay tuned. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that footage of the range. So from a shooting perspective, both of these firearms are certainly very capable of some very accurate shooting and some very enjoyable shooting at the range. One nice thing about full-size firearms, they absorb a little bit more recoil, they're a little bit heavier, and so you can really spend a lot of time at the range shooting and not wearing yourself out, if that's a concern for you at all. Now, when I took these two guns to compare the two together, it took a little while to warm up for both of them, which was kind of unusual, especially for the Glock. I, generally speaking, can get into a Glock pretty quick and start putting rounds on targets and happily, and usually it turns out pretty well. For whatever reason on that day, it took some time, but both of them shot reasonably well. If you've seen my other video on the M&P 2.0, I struggled a little bit more with it, and I think there are a couple of reasons why. So let's go ahead and dive into the triggers here for just a moment or two. Again, unloaded, of course. So when I first got this firearm, I noticed that the uptake on the trigger was incredibly gritty. I will say, though, to Smith & Wesson's credit, that grittiness has by and large worked itself out, which is good. I can still hear it a little bit, and I can still feel it just a little bit, but it is significantly better. So that's really good, and I know they made some improvements on the 2.0 trigger. So from an uptake standpoint on this hinged trigger design right here, we've got a fair amount of uptake right here, and we get really close to the back of the trigger housing, so to speak. And then we've got our break, and it's a reasonably nice break, I have to say. And then we get our reset, and there's your reset right there, and then we go back out to the start. And I'm going to do this again. One of the things about the reset on Smith & Wesson M&Ps, the older versions, the reset was pretty abysmal. It was hardly there. It was hardly tactile, audible, any of those types of things. So they've definitely made some improvements on that. So we'll do this again. There's our uptake. There's our break. I'm going to hold my finger here. And there's your reset, and then we're back out to the start. So from a trigger perspective, I think they definitely have made some improvements since the M&P 1.0. However, I will say it is still not my favorite trigger, and I mentioned it's taken me a little bit longer to connect with this firearm. One of the biggest reasons, and like it or not, I wrap my finger through. My fingers are pretty long, so it's not very comfortable for me to shoot with the pad of my finger. I can do it. I know how to do it. I've just been shooting this way the majority of my life, and it's more comfortable to me. So it is what it is. So because of that, and trying to get my finger back here, especially with my other hand, that can present some complications. It's certainly doable, but it's just not as conducive for me from a shooting perspective. So I could definitely do the pad of my finger, but especially with this hinge design right here, I'm just not a big fan of how this feels, especially using this particular technique. So I stick to the old technique, but it just, I don't connect quite as well with this. It's gotten a little better, but it's still not as good as I would like it to be. So from a Glock standpoint, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the internals have changed on the Glock 17. That is absolutely true. One of the biggest ones is the safety plunger, whatever you want to call it, firing pin safety, whatever it is. It's a ramp design rather than a round design. And I think it does lend for a slightly smoother trigger, although this is still, without question, a Glock trigger out of the box. No internals or anything have been changed, so this is just as expected. So from a take-up standpoint, the take-up is significantly shorter than the M&P. It's probably one of the reasons why I like this trigger. I prefer triggers with less take-up. And once we get to our wall, definitely defined, we get to our break, and it's a pretty giant thud right there. It's not the cleanest, but it definitely does the job. You know that this gun has gone off. And then from a reset standpoint, I have to say, Glocks have some of the best resets out on the market. They're not necessarily the shortest or the cleanest, but they are very audible. They're very tactile. That you can definitely know where they're going to land. They're very predictable. And then it goes back out to the start. So I'm going to do that again. There's our uptake. There's our break. There's our reset. And then back out to the start. So from an out-of-the-box Glock standpoint, I have to say this is actually a pretty good trigger, and I've warmed up to it pretty quickly. So in terms of triggers, I have to give the leg up to the Glock 17. It just works a little bit better for me. I've spent a lot more time behind Glocks, so I have to be kind of fair about that. But I also connect with it a little bit better from a physics standpoint. So I have to give the leg up there. So now we're coming to the end of the video, and of course this is always very challenging because like I said in the very beginning, both of these guns are good guns. There's no question in my mind, and depending on the shooter, either one of these can be extremely accurate and a lot of fun to shoot. So like I said before, if you've got either one or looking at either one, I think you're doing great. But when I sit back and I think about both of these firearms and the features and all of those types of things, and then wheel in a little bit of value as well, because the Smith & Wesson, you're going to be able to get somewhere in the low to mid 500s, maybe a little bit more depending on where you look. If it's a local gun store, I've seen them even upwards of $600. And the Gen 5 Glock is going to run right around $550 or so, almost consistently where I've seen it. You could probably do a little bit better online. So from a value standpoint, neither one of these beats the one or the other. Now I know the plastic sights on the Glock kind of dings it a little bit, and I must say I ding it as well, but we're all pretty used to that, and you could definitely have the Glock steel sights on there for a couple dollars more. So it's kind of a wash in my mind a little bit. But again, all things considered, when I'm thinking about both of these firearms, I must say, if I could only have one, and you're probably going to see this coming, I have to choose the Glock 17. And I know there are going to be some boos and hisses in the audience. I appreciate that. Not everybody's a fan of Glock these days, and I think they could have done a little bit better with the Gen 5 myself. That said, for this shooter, I connect with this particular Glock better than I do with the Smith & Wesson M&P 2.0. So if I could only have one, I would choose the Gen 5 Glock 17. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say about this, whether you agree or disagree or have any thoughts on these, experiences on these. I always look forward to those, and you guys are great about all your comments. As always, be sure to check us out on Wednesday nights. I get together with my buddies Big Johnson Guns and Gear and 1776 or Bust, and we talk all things firearms. I've got their links down below. Check those guys out because we switch off hosting duties. And don't forget to check out Abaddon Apparel. That link is down below as well for all your Second Amendment apparel needs. So check that out. Looking forward to hearing those comments. And once again, thanks so much for joining me. I will see you next time.